President Cyril Ramaphosa, or President-elect rather, Cyril Ramaphosa will be inaugurated on Africa Day, that's May 25, as our country celebrates 25 years of democracy. In the west of the continent, Muhammadu Buhari of Nigeria will also be sworn in for a second term on May 29, 20 years since that country transited to democracy after years of what is said to be draconian military rule. Tonight, we track Africa's biggest economies over 2 decades. In Johannesburg, here in the studio, we're joined by Professor Chris Isike, lecturer and academic researcher at the University of Pretoria. In our Durban studios is Dr. Aghogho Akpome, lecturer and academic researcher at the University of Zululand. Welcome to you both. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much, and good evening to our viewers.
Perhaps let me start with you, Professor.
Thank you.
Let me just first start with you, Professor. Just in terms of the democratic journey of both countries, are they comparable? Are we comparing apples with apples?
Well, yes, they are comparable in many respects, and they're also different in many respects as well. For example, it's been a topsy-turvy kind of, advancement in terms of democratic consolidation for both countries. They've been hit with cases of issues of allegations of corruption, and there's been periodic elections which have gone on basically fairly well enough. So on that score, you could say that both countries are comparable, and they're just about hitting the 25 years mark since democracy. In the case of Nigeria, 20 years, and South Africa, 25 years, about the same period.
Dr. Akpome, just your thoughts. I mean, both countries recently holding elections, and plebiscites are by themselves at least expression of the will of what people want. But the outcome of those elections, the polls, are they indicative of the people's will?
Thanks, JP. So that's a very interesting question, and I think that's at the heart of the questions we should be asking. My take at this moment of reflection is that we should be asking hard questions. And one of the questions is exactly what you've asked. To what extent can we say that what we have had in Nigeria for the past 20 years and in South Africa for the past 25 years and elsewhere on the African continent in general is a reflection of the people's will? But more importantly, to what extent are the democratic experiences, to what extent have they fulfilled the people's expectations? I think it's clear that there's still a lot of disappointment, there's still a lot that people expect they've not seen, and I think we should be asking ourselves questions why this is so. Yes, let me stop there for now. I think we should be asking ourselves why this is so. What does it say about democracy? What does it say about us as a people? Well,
which is what I was going to ask you. The term democracy in itself is derived from the two Greek words demo, which is for people, and kratos for rule. So without being too pedantic about it, is there evidence of this in the governance systems of both countries?
Yes, my view is that yes, there is an extent to which there is the involvement of the people in governance. But the crucial question is to what extent? And to what extent is the people's will able to determine what happens? And to what extent is their input in democracy in Africa, in these two countries, to what extent does it affect the people's destinies? I think that's the question we need to ask. I think definitely we agree that since the people's expectations are actually not yet fully met, there are those who, it's a spectrum. There are those who are more optimistic, there are those who have more thumbs up for these countries, there are those who thumbs down the more. That will make us understand the extent to which the people have themselves been able to determine their own destinies using this particular form of governance.
Professor Isike, you'd like to respond to that, yes?
Yes. So it boils down to the quality of participation. There's been involvement, but like he's saying, is a quality of involvement. So the involvement has been largely reducible to electoral involvement, where people vote and that's it. But if you compare Nigeria and South Africa, you find that in South Africa there's much more qualitative participation in terms of policy making. If you look at the IDPs and how they are managed from ward levels, there's a system, there's a structure that enables participation. Of course, when it goes upwards, some of the people's choices and preferences are nullified by higher structures within, say, for instance, the ruling party. In the case of Nigeria, you cannot really see those kinds of structures that enable participation apart from every 4 years of electoral participation.
Just reflecting on a conversation I had just on the Malawian elections, the governance and electoral expert I was speaking to was saying part of the problem is that we don't thoroughly examine the political economy in itself when we talk about elections, and also particularly looking at to why people get into governments. But I want to look at also the inherent qualities of the kind of model of governance when we talk about democracy, freedom of expression, eradication of poverty, quality life, etc. In South Africa, while elections are said to be free and fair, is that illuminated in the living conditions, the everyday lives of South Africans?
Absolutely not, and I think you got it spot on when you talk about the quality of governance and how that translates to economic benefits, or what they call democracy dividends for people. So for me, to boil down to the notion of government, the idea of government, the concept and idea of states that we inherited, these states, as we have them in Africa, are not actually African. They are states in Africa rather than being African states, because they were imposed from outside. They've not grown organically, and so you find a disconnect between traditional, sometimes what the people call informal pre-colonial structures, trying to converge, and of course contesting with the former structures of the modern state systems that were introduced. So again, it also goes that kind of imposition causes a lot of confusion in terms of what is the purpose of those states. Those states were actually created to facilitate exploitation, and those who replaced the colonialists that imposed them carried on in the same format that they understood the essence of the state and government. And so, for instance, that's why you have a situation where people get into government, win an election and celebrate, rather than thinking in the Solomonic way, asking for wisdom, because they know that this is a very hard job to do. So it's the wrong notion of government, wrong understanding of government, where government and the state is seen as a facilitator of exploitation rather as a vector of development.
So, Dr. Akpome, I'd like to come to you and ask this question. There are those who are saying Nigeria cannot boast of a free and fair election, or elections at all. Is that fair comment?
I think it's an absolutely fair comment. There are there's empirical evidence of infractions, serious electoral infractions in the elections that we've had. And there's the response of the people themselves, except in 2015, for instance, where the incumbent lost and accepted his loss without going to court. It has become a tradition in Nigeria for people to contest their losses. That people might dismiss this as losers not being good losers, but then it says something about the credibility of the process, because if a process is very transparent and that transparency is there for the world to see, then it's actually ridiculous for people to challenge the outcome of the process. The very fact that processes are...
Allow me to jump in, Dr. Akpome. You're talking about transparency. And there are those who said, if you're looking at celebrating 20 years of democracy, it means you've moved away from militarized rule. But there are those who've questioned whether that can be said of the elections themselves, that they've been run in such a manner. What is your view of that?
Well, it also relates to what Chris has said. It's a matter of what kinds of states do we have. The colonial states from which we developed, or which some would argue we still are, was essentially extractive and coercive, where the powers of the state are often always deployed to coerce the citizens of the state. And the expression of free will, even the drawing of the memorandums of understanding by which the people who constitute an African state come together, there's hardly any case in Africa in which we can say that the people themselves, Chris used the word organic, of their own accord drew up the terms of association themselves. And of course, we must not lose sight. You made a comment about the political economy. We must not lose sight of the role of neoliberal capitalism, which is extractive, which is exploitative, which prioritizes the maximization of profit. And it's a global economy in which African states exist on the fringes. We cannot rule out the influences that these have on what goes on within the state. In Nigeria, for example, especially during military rule, we saw the situations where the oil multinationals were in cahoots with the military juntas and were actually implicated in some very serious infractions of human rights in several parts of the country, especially in the oil producing regions. So given this kind of situation, it is clear that what we have is not what we desire, it's not what we asked for, and that to some extent these elections are a cover-up for what is going on, which is it's not what the people want, it's not what the people desire.
I'm going to take from what Dr. Akpome has been saying about the kind of relationships that post-colonial states have had with their former colonizers. But when we look at the diplomatic relations between South Africa and Nigeria, some have said it's tenuous because of how imbalanced it is, especially if you look at South Africa's commercial interests in Nigeria. Is there evidence of this neo-colonial characteristics or attitude one to the other?
Well, the relations between Nigeria and South Africa are,
tenuous at
best. Yeah, at best, like you said. But it's not reflective of the kinds of dependency relationship that exists between colonies and their former colonizers. So the relationship between Nigeria and South Africa is influenced more by regional contestation for power, for leadership within the continent. Of course, it was worsened by the relations between President Mandela and Sani Abacha in 1998 after the hanging of the Ogoni Nine. So I would say that. But then you
had better relations with former President Thabo Mbeki.
Yeah, and that's what I'm going to. So it depends. The relationship have gone, good or bad, depending on who's president at the time, because of course the president would have a say on the foreign policy posture of the country. So it was very good during Obasanjo and Thabo Mbeki, and then it started soaring under Mbeki. Zuma. There is hope that depending on how the Abuja government chooses to engage, there could be.
We did see Pretoria go to Abuja last year and pull out an olive branch. But more importantly, Dr. Akpome, I'd like to hear from you. Do you think, Professor here talks about a healthy relationship, but I'd like to look at the two regional powers' individual influence, especially when it comes to transformation in the strategic bodies such as the AU and the United Nations. Have they been pulling together, and has it been for the good of the so-called United States of Africa?
Well, thank you. If you don't mind, I would like to agree with Chris. I would like to begin by agreeing with Professor Isike's idea that the relations are not subservient. We really can't. And I think sometimes commentators read too much into the rivalry between South Africa and Nigeria. And I think a lot of that rivalry is healthy. I don't think there is a concrete basis for speaking in terms of a neo-colonial dimension to that relationship. Yes, South Africa appears to have much more business, economic interest in Nigeria, but coming from the point of view than Nigerians have in South Africa, for instance. But speaking from a cultural studies point of view, there is tremendous affinity. There's tremendous, if you permit me to use the word love, of mutual admiration between South Africa and Nigeria in cultural affairs. If we listen to the music that's been coming from Nigeria and from South Africa, we see a lot of collaborations. So I think if we look at that, we would see something that is healthy in the relationship in that regard. But now, directly to your question, there is the need, there continues to be the need for African countries, in particular these two countries we are discussing tonight, to pull together. And the jury, I think the verdict so far is they've not done that sufficiently. And I think it's because African countries have not given much attention to Africa. Individual African countries have not given much attention to the need for their coming together as Africa.
And I think they need to address the conversation on perhaps also a very sensitive conversation, but therein lies the rub, the people-to-people relations. And you said, Dr. Akpome, that there has been some sort of exaggeration. So when we look at the so-called xenophobic attacks between South Africans, and we'll speak about Nigerians here because we're looking at the two countries, is there then a clear understanding that notwithstanding, there is mutual respect for each other and recognition of each other as brothers and sisters?
Well, there are two levels of the relationship. Okay, there's a state-to-state and the people-to-people, like you mentioned. At the state-to-state level, there's mutual admiration and respect, for each other. But at the people-to-people, it's much more. It's a bit more hostile. That is largely because of the wrong perceptions that South Africans have of Nigerians generally as a people. Of course, there are people who, like every country, have their criminal elements. We may have a lot of those in South Africa, but there is also the other side of Nigerians in South Africa who contribute meaningfully, either be in the education sector, as reflected by myself and Dr. Akpome. You also have in the medical sector, in business. So these things are happening, but of course, bad news sells, and that tends to affect the relationship at the people-to-people level. But I will also mention very quickly of a study that was done in 2012 that showed that relationship is beginning to change through South Africans watching the African magic and beginning to have more respect for Nigerian people, learn the language, the culture, and that has tended to boost the relationships positively. And
as you say, it goes both ways. Thank you very much to you gentlemen for joining us.